Welcome to the Culturally Responsive Teaching webinar focusing on vocabulary and language. Ask any educator, one of the greatest challenges for students is lack of vocabulary skills. And when we couple this with cultural and linguistic diversity, it can become a bit overwhelming. As we look to improve student performance, vocabulary and language is an important piece of the puzzle. This webinar will seek to give you some research-based practices and strategies for your classroom. Please have paper and writing utensils ready to make notes during this webinar as we look not only at information, but ask some probing questions. This will be called a reflection journal for sake of clarity. It seems almost impossible to overstate the power of words. Literally, they have changed and will continue to change the course of world history. Perhaps the greatest tools we can give students for succeeding, not only in their education, but more generally in life, is a large, rich vocabulary and the skills for using those words. Our ability to function in today's complex social and economic world is mightily affected by our language skills and word knowledge. In addition to the vital importance of vocabulary for success in life, a large vocabulary is more specifically predictive and reflective of high levels of reading achievement. The report of the National Reading Panel, for example, concluded, "The importance of vocabulary knowledge has long been recognized in the development of reading skills." As early as 1924, researchers noted that growth in reading power relies on continuous growth in word knowledge. In reality, cultural responsiveness is more of a process than a strategy. Teachers recognize the cultural capital and are able to respond to students' use of these cultural learning tools positively by noticing, naming, and affirming when students use them in the service of learning. The most common cultural tools for processing information utilizes the brain's memory systems: music, repetition, metaphor, recitation, physical manipulation of content, and ritual. The teacher is responsive when she is able to mirror these ways of learning in her instruction using similar strategies to scaffold learning. For example, a science teacher decided, rather than continue assigning a word list and have students look words up in the dictionary, she could redesign word study using some combination of the cultural tools familiar to her students. So instead of a list, learning weekly vocabulary was more active and game-like. She reported that students were not only re-engaged, but made noticeable progress in using their knowledge of science vocabulary during the lessons. You'll notice that there's no mention of Africa, Mexico, or race at all. It's a misconception that culturally responsive instruction has to mention race. It's not race that matters in culturally responsive teaching, but awareness of implicit bias that gets in the way of healthy student-teacher relationships and narrows interpretations of learning that ignore the cultural tools students bring to class. Student-centered vocabulary and language are keys to hooking students' attention and ensuring that they will be receptive enough to learn the curriculum and textbook vocabulary. Try to find ways to infuse hip-hop, sports, and other student interests without seeming fake. Make honest connections, but be sincere and be yourself. Later in this webinar, we will discuss ways to help students integrate and make meaningful connections. But before we get started on that, let's take a quick look and review of vocabulary tiers and how it affects student instruction. Look at the pyramid illustrating the tier of words. What are some conclusions you can draw from looking at it in regards to frequency? Tier 1 consists of everyday speech, basic and general vocabulary. Most of your culturally and linguistically diverse students will have two sets of everyday speech. They may seem to have a little everyday English vocabulary, but don't forget, they also have a separate language and even slang vocabulary. Culturally diverse students may be used to having their own vocabulary. Tier 2 words are often referred to as general academic words and are far more likely to appear in written text than in speech. They are the descriptive vocabulary. And finally, Tier 3 is referred to as domain-specific. They are specific to a field of study, and they are precise vocabulary. Let's look a little deeper into each of the tiers. Tier 1 consists of basic and general vocabulary. Let's look at the word old. Old is a Tier 1 word. It means that something has aged. Most everyone knows what the word means, but it is not very specific. Old also has some nuances in meaning with perception and usage. For example, in Tier 2 descriptive vocabulary, the term old, we might find words such as enduring, aging, mature, or elderly. This helps strengthen the definition and helps solidify some of the nuances in meaning. For example, someone who is 40 might be considered old by a young child, but are not considered elderly. The descriptive vocabulary allows readers and writers to more aptly define their vocabulary to create a clearer picture. Tier 3 deals with precise vocabulary and is even more specific in its meaning. Words in this tier define more clearly and concisely the intent of the meaning. In Tier 3, we find words for old might be antique, ancient, decrepit. These Tier 3 words help students paint a clearer picture of meaning with their words. Let's look at another example. This word shows fire or flame as Tier 1 words. Remember, almost everyone knows what these two words mean. Tier 2 words are blaze and fiery. Does this seem more descriptive and help you paint a better picture of the word? And for Tier 3, conflagration and inferno, these words are very image specific. Moving from Tier 1 to Tier 3 words can help students in writing and in speaking. Now let's think about culturally and linguistically diverse students. Here are some strategies to specifically teach vocabulary, all the tiers of words. Use instructional read-aloud events. Provide direct instruction in the meanings of clusters of words and individual words. Systematically teach students the meaning of prefixes, suffixes, and root words. Link spelling instruction to reading and vocabulary instruction. Teach the effective, efficient, realistic use of dictionaries, thesauruses, and other reference works. Teach, model, and encourage the application of a word learning strategy. Encourage wide reading, and create a keen awareness and a deep understanding of interesting language and words. And here are some ways you can enhance vocabulary and language development with culturally and linguistically diverse students in your classroom. Understand the assets and capabilities that students' families bring to their parenting. Understand the cultures represented in your classroom by getting to know your students. Visit the neighborhoods where they live. Listen to students talk about their lives. Understand what and whom they care about. Consistently engage in real conversation and dialogue with your students. For example, if you have English language learners in your class, go to lunch with them. Try to understand their reality by actively listening to them and the sense that they are making of the curriculum. And use small group personalized instruction to help students develop their academic language skills. Remember, collaboration and connections are key to success in vocabulary development, but more than that, also to allow time for students to internalize and make their own connections to the literature. Relevance, rigor, and relationships are vital to student engagement, but will also increase vocabulary retention. Relevant vocabulary will hook students' attention so they can eventually learn and understand academic vocabulary, the textbook, and the real world. Grab students' attention with their own language and stories before presenting academic language. Each population is different, though, and it would be a mistake for teachers to assume that all urban kids relate to gangs, basketball, or hip-hop. The key here is that each teacher makes an effort to learn more about his or her students, puts himself or herself in their shoes, and figures out what it takes to make learning more accessible. Be creative. Teach in a way that relates familiar experiences to your students and makes the learning process as easy for them as possible. The textbook is just one resource of many you can use to achieve this end. Another aspect of culturally responsive instruction that has been effective concerns the delivery of instruction to students. Though it is critical to make the curriculum accessible and relevant to students, it is also important that the content be delivered in an engaging and interesting way. All too often, a teacher has a brilliant idea or lesson, but the delivery is so boring and didactic that students get turned off and miss out on the experience. This has been discussed in our webinar on student engagement, but it again needs to be mentioned how all of the elements of this webinar series will weave together to create a culturally responsive classroom. Helping students to develop a strong reading vocabulary requires more than having them look up words in a dictionary. Rather, students need instruction that will help them acquire new word knowledge and develop strategies to enable them to increase the depth of that knowledge over time. To help students develop word knowledge in breadth and depth, we must first recognize 4 fundamental obstacles and then develop teaching practices to address those obstacles. These are 4 key obstacles. The size of the task. The number of words that students need to learn is exceedingly large. The differences between spoken English and written or literate English. The vocabulary of written English, particularly the literate English that students encounter in textbooks and other school materials, differs greatly from that of spoken, especially conversational English. Students, both English language learners and those for whom English is the first language, may have limited exposure to literate English outside of school. The limitations of sources of information about words. The sources of information about words that are readily available to students are dictionaries, word parts, and context pose their own problems. Each can be difficult to use, uninformative, or even misleading. Encoded vocabulary. The complexity of word knowledge. Knowing a word involves much more than knowing its definition, and simply memorizing a dictionary definition does not guarantee the ability to use a word in reading or writing. Adding to the complexity is the fact that different kinds of words place different demands on learners. So now that we know the 4 obstacles, let's take a deeper dive into each of these. Let's begin with the size of the task. Although there is still debate over exactly how many and what words are essential for students to learn so as to become skillful readers, there is no question that skillful readers learn words by the thousands. There is also no doubt that without instructional intervention, the vocabulary gap between more and less skillful readers continues to widen over time. We know that, on average, students add 2,000 to 3,000 words a year to their reading vocabularies. This means that they learn from 6 to 8 new words each day, an enormous achievement. Individual differences in vocabulary size also involve large numbers. Some 5th grade students may know thousands more words than other students in the same classroom. As a teacher, you know the difference this could make. Students who know the meanings of many words catch on to and understand new ideas and concepts much faster than those students with limited vocabularies. Early in children's lives, differences in word knowledge levels begin to appear. This in part is due to the varying range of words children are exposed to within their homes and communities. Exposure to new words can differ dramatically among the children of families from different socioeconomic classes. It has been shown, for example, that young children of parents with jobs classified as professional can be exposed to 50% more words than are children of parents classified as working class, and to twice as many words as children of parents who receive welfare support. This finding does not mean that all, or even most children from low SES backgrounds are condemned to lives of linguistic poverty. Rather, it underscores the importance of finding ways to provide children with more activities that promote language development and vocabulary growth, beginning in the earliest days of school. Children whose homes have not prepared them for the variety of English necessary for educational success can learn to master this language through well-designed school experiences. The second obstacle to vocabulary development is the differences between spoken English and written English. Most spoken language, and especially the language of face-to-face conversation, is less rich and varied in vocabulary use than is written language. This is partly because speakers have a variety of communicative tools at their disposal, gestures, tone of voice, and facial expression that are not available to writers. In conversation, accuracy of communication depends more on feedback from listeners than on getting what is said exactly right. Think back to your own experience dealing with someone who doesn't speak the same language as you. What are the tools you use to aid in comprehension? In writing, and especially in literate writing, the primary communicative tool is precision in word choice. Another reason vocabulary development is so important. In fact, a conversation among college-educated adults contains, on average, less rich and varied vocabulary than does a typical children's book. The language of television is sometimes more varied than everyday conversation, but it seldom matches the level of language used in children's books as well. The differences between spoken and written English can pose major problems for students learning English, whose vocabulary difficulties sometimes can be disguised by their conversational fluency. For example, children of immigrant parents can become proficient in everyday conversation in less than 2 years. However, it may take a longer period of time for these children to become proficient in literate English. If teachers are not aware of the difference in the time it takes to achieve conversational fluency and proficiency with written English, they might diagnose as learning or reading disabled a conversationally proficient English language learner who has trouble understanding textbooks. Learning the vocabulary of literate English can be a problem as well for students for whom English is the first language. Words such as renovate, restore, delve, and allude, which might appear in a story from a 5th grade textbook, are rarely encountered in everyday speech. We cannot assume that children will be familiar with all the words they encounter in school and in textbooks just because they come from English-speaking homes or just because they are proficient in conversational English. The third obstacle to vocabulary development are the limitations of the sources of information about words. Learning on their own or as part of a lesson, students have 3 main sources of information about words: dictionary, word parts, and context. All of these are important, but each is also problematic. Dictionaries. Although dictionary use is a main feature of most vocabulary instruction, many students do not receive the kind of instruction they need to learn how to use a dictionary effectively. Traditional instruction in dictionary use focuses on having students look up words and use information from the definitions they find to write sentences. This kind of instruction appears to produce only a superficial understanding and rapid forgetting of a word. Later in this webinar, we will give some information on some strategies and tools using personal dictionaries and thesauruses to make connections and build meaningful vocabulary. Word parts. Students' ability to use word parts, prefixes, suffixes, and roots to interpret new words can contribute greatly to their vocabulary growth. Nevertheless, word parts are not a completely reliable source of information about word meanings. To illustrate, consider a pair of words such as the following, which share recognizable parts, but which are not clearly related in meaning: casual, casualty; emerge, emergency; sign, resign; awe, awful. And finally, context. Students can acquire a great deal of vocabulary knowledge as they pick up the meanings of words from context as they read widely in appropriately challenging text. However, the chance of learning the meaning of any particular word from one encounter with that word in context is rather slim. To use dictionary definitions, word parts, and context effectively requires awareness of words and flexible thinking, metacognitive and metalinguistic sophistication that many students do not possess. In fact, the students who are most in need of vocabulary growth are likely to be the ones least effective at using these sources of information. And the fourth obstacle to vocabulary development is encoded vocabulary. Explanations of culturally responsive teaching need to be clear and specific so that a wide range of readers can understand what is being said without too much difficulty. One way to accomplish this is to minimize the use of encoded vocabulary. When this is unavoidable, decode and demystify it. For instance, rarely use terms like voice, deconstruct, and interrogate, words that are very common in discussions about inequities and injustices, but define what they mean and how to use them correctly. Think about the word culture. It is a very powerful word and concept and useful in conceptions of culturally responsive teaching. Shift between using the term itself and its equivalent meanings as well. Instead of simply saying culture, sometimes say values, attitudes, and beliefs, customs and traditions, heritages and contributions, or experiences and perspectives, all of which could be considered as equivalents of culture. Linguistically responsive instruction validates and affirms the home languages of students. It builds awareness of the rule-governed structures of all languages. Linguistically responsive instructive is additive and seeks to effectively add standard English and academic language to the student's linguistic repertoire, but not at the expense of devaluing the home language. I want you to get out your reflection journal now and answer these questions. What is your linguistic identity? Where did you acquire your home language? How many languages or ways do you speak? You may pause the video now as you take time to reflect. Around the world, people communicate with one another using a dazzling array of languages, 7,000 or so all told, and each language requires very different things from its speakers. For example, suppose I want to tell you that I saw Uncle Vanyo on 42nd Street. In Mian, a language spoken in New Guinea, the verb I use would reveal whether the event happened just now, yesterday, or in the distant past. Whereas in Indonesian, the verb wouldn't even give away whether it had already happened or was still coming up. In Russian, the verb would reveal my gender. In Mandarin, I would have to specify whether the uncle is maternal or paternal and whether he is related by blood or marriage, because there are different words for all of these different types of uncles. And in Paraha, a language spoken in the Amazon, I couldn't say 42nd because there are no words for exact numbers, just words for few and many. So let's think about figurative language through the lens of a culturally and linguistically diverse learner. Let's talk about literature and literary elements. Let's consider an example of culturally responsive teaching. English teachers can use a variety of methods to teach similes, including examples with familiar sports stars and relatable situations that involve similes and metaphors. For example, Kobe flies like an eagle to the basket, and the crowd is frozen in anticipation. It's also possible to use hip-hop lyrics to teach literary elements, such as theme and tone. Many lyrics easily lend themselves to interesting and engaging lessons on mood or character analysis. Once the teacher hooks students' attention and makes sure they understand the relevant concept, he or she can then incorporate the standard textbook, which may include more traditional literature by Shakespeare, Faulkner, or Salinger. Students will likely be more willing to analyze a Shakespearean conflict if they already understand the concept from exposure to lessons that dealt with hip-hop or stories that directly related to their lives. Responsive vocabulary instruction entails focusing on acquisition of words through effective vocabulary strategies, not on memorization. Building on the conceptual knowledge of the students, what they bring to class, which is validating and affirming. Providing planned and explicit synonym-antonym development, and utilizing slang, profanity, and racially charged terms as opportunities to expand students' academic vocabulary when appropriate. The following 3 learning objectives can be used to infuse language and vocabulary development. Objective 1, learn to level the words within the content vocabulary. Objective 2, learn to teach the focused vocabulary strategies through the use of tools, such as word webs, graphic organizers, and personal thesaurus and personal dictionary. And Objective 3, learn to use reinforcement, practice activities throughout the week, and the use of various types of assessment. Practice is the key component to success. This becomes the difference between knowledge and application. It's great to have a word of the day, but how effective is it if students can't use it? Let's look at the dimensions of vocabulary development from 1942, but they are still applicable today. Generalization, ability to define a word. Application, ability to select or recognize situation appropriately. Breadth, ability to apply multiple meanings. Precision, ability to apply a term correctly to all situations and to recognize inappropriate use. Availability, ability to actually use the word. This will require practice, especially engaged practice. Let's look at synonyms. Responsive vocabulary instruction includes focused, intentional synonym development. Many non-standard language users use one word many ways. Instructional modifications can address this dynamic, and students are able to be more precise language users. Some examples are these. The little boy is bad. The little boy is disobedient. The milk is bad. The milk is sour. I had a bad day. I had a terrible day. I feel bad about telling a lie. I feel guilty about telling a lie. A good tool to use with Tier 2 vocabulary is allowing students to make personal thesauruses because it builds on the conceptually coded words students already know. Intensive work with synonyms and antonyms, those Tier 2 words, provides students with an expanded vocabulary that contributes to success in the academic curriculum. It's a great writing tool to support written language development, and it's an opportunity to use slang. Another tool to help students with Tier 3 words is using a personal dictionary to allow them to make connections. Students must create an illustration and personal connection. However, the teacher will most likely need to provide a definition for terms. Let's look at the funnel analogy you saw in the first webinar. Are we fitting education into culture or culture into education? Take out your reflection journal and answer these questions. Do you personally struggle with students using slang? Is there a time it is appropriate? When? What non-negotiables do you have regarding proper use of language? As teachers, it is so important to ensure students learn to develop vocabulary and are able to successfully use it appropriately. One of the tenets of culturally responsive teaching is that we are inclusive of all students, but it is also important that we use where they are, where they come from, and all that it entails to help them develop their best selves. However, it is very important for culturally and linguistically diverse learners to have the tools to navigate various situations. Even with Tier 1 vocabulary, students need to be aware of the importance of choosing the right words. Here are 5 questions students need to answer when it comes to choosing the best word for a situation. With whom is the student communicating? What is the topic of the communication? When is the communication occurring? Where is the communication taking place? And why the communication? What's the purpose? Remember that it is also important to validate and affirm a student's linguistic capital. If you've ever had teenagers or worked with teenagers, you have probably felt the pain of having them use a word inappropriately. The language of youth is temporary, dynamic, and peer-driven. It is also descriptive, colorful, and meaningful to youth culture. The chart here shows how we can help students use slang vocabulary as an academic term. This chart can be used in conjunction with tasks for reinforcement and practice. Students need multiple opportunities to interact and engage with students. Reinforcement and practice are essential to support students as they are internalizing new words. Students are able to engage in discussion about new words and concepts. Reinforcement and practice help students to further understand the word and be able to apply it in a variety of contexts. And reinforcement and practice activities are also effective ways for teachers to informally assess students. Contrastive analysis refers to the practice of comparing and contrasting the linguistic structure of two languages. For our purpose, the home language and standard American English. This strategy facilitates the awareness of the differences or rules between the language they bring from home and the language of school, what is often referred to as code switching. You need to consider communication in the classroom versus communication on the playground. Conversation with your financial planner versus a conversation with your friend. Conversational versus academic language. Writing an essay to get into college versus writing a letter in order to win free tickets to a concert. Think about it. Are we equipping our students to be able to make vocabulary their own? Thank you for participating in today's webinar on vocabulary and language. It is our hope that this information, along with the rest of the webinars in this series, helps better inform, equip, and maybe even challenge some preconceptions you may have held. One thing I'd like to leave you with: the ability to communicate is critical to success. By giving culturally and linguistically diverse students the tools to understand, apply, and utilize vocabulary and language for all situations, you are giving them keys to a better future.